All right. Welcome, everyone, to this virtual workshop on creating accessible electronic materials with AI tools. We have some wonderful guest speakers with us today. Jill Stefaniak from the University of Georgia, Amy Lomellini from Anthology, and Stephanie Moore from the University of New Mexico. Before I let them get started, I wanted to just do a brief introduction of who we are. If you're not affiliated with AECT, which is the Association of Educational Communications and Technology, that's our professional organization. And within that organization, we are the Division of Distance Learning, which I am honored to be serving as president of this year. And so if you don't have a professional home or you're not familiar with our organization, I invite you to check out that website. And if you have any questions or want to join us for a future event, our conference this year is in Las Vegas in October, and next year it's going to be in Chicago. So with that being said, I would like to turn it over to our wonderful guest for this workshop. And thank you for being with us. We appreciate it. Now, want to introduce yourselves, or did I do that enough?
I think you did it. I think you did a good enough job introducing us. I'm seeing thumbs ups from Amy and Stephanie. So if we can go to the next slide.
Okay, sounds good.
And so for our agenda today, we've got a lot to unpack today within our short amount of time that we have with you all today. But with so many conversations going on about generative AI and its influence or its impact it is currently having, or we're anticipating that's going to continue having in instructional design practices, we have worked with the Division of Distance Learning to kind of start looking at what are some ways that we can integrate this into a meaningful way as instructional designers. Full disclaimer, and you'll probably hear us saying this a lot, we're going to talk about AI tools today, but the takeaway is not that we can just rely solely on tools to do our jobs as instructional designers. Again, there's been a lot of questions about that. We've had people that have been worried, is AI going to replace instructional designers? I do not think that it's going to. I think there's going to be opportunities for us to leverage AI to be able to become more efficient at certain tasks. But at the end of the day, it's our responsibility as instructional designers to make sure and ensure that we are designing stuff that is facilitating learning and improving performance. And so one of the ways that we can do this is by constantly having that critical eye, really keeping our learners as the center of everything that we do. And so the phrasing that we've been talking about in our conversations amongst ourselves is thinking about, what does it mean to be a deliberate designer? And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about what are some things to keep in mind so that we are designing with deliberate intention. We're also going to talk about what does this look like when we start considering the variety of AI tools and accessibility considerations. And then we're going to have you, again, within this consolidated amount of time, talk about what are ways in which we can deliberate and engage in reflective practice, which I'm sure as many people in the audience know is so important to our craft as instructional designers. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so one of the things that we would just kind of want to just go over briefly is when we think about generative AI as design support, very much thinking about it in ways in which, in terms of how can it be a supportive mechanism for us in our work as instructional designers. And so we know that there's a lot of opportunities where we're able to expedite certain design processes, where we're able to use generative AI to help with personalization of content, coming up with a variety of different examples, making adjustments depending on, again, the inputs that we're putting into it. We're starting to see where instructional designers can use AI to optimize time, where we can input different information regarding our learning audiences, and also kind of use it as a tool for design as well as an objective of thoughtful design practice. And so today, what we want to be thinking about and what we're imploring everyone to do when they leave is not just think about ways in which we can leverage it for efficiency's sake, but also think about how can we use generative AI to help support us in our reflective practice throughout that design process. Next slide. Thank you. And so when we look at what this is looking like in a in instructional design, obviously there, we're seeing a lot of core functionality. And so we're and I feel like anytime I talk to someone, there's a new tool or there's a new app that's out there. The rate at which AI has been increasing seems to be at an exponential rate. So again, as a field, we're having a lot of difficulty keeping up because there's always something else coming on. But again, this is where we're looking at AI systems that are generating content for us, text, images, videos. And so again, keeping in mind that there's a lot of opportunity for us to be able to do certain things that typically would have taken us a lot longer to do. We also look at, we've got opportunities for key learning affordances. So again, just the availability and the ability to do rapid automated development. If you're working with more global audiences, being able to engage in translations much quicker. There's a lot of opportunities for us to really improve upon scalability and efficiency in content, especially when we're designing for diverse learning audiences. But I will say with that, there's also the caveat that we cannot rely solely on this without checking things. And we're going to kind of talk about that today in ways in which we can pull from what we know as instructional designers, pull from our toolkits on what we know about learning context as we're moving forward with engaging in deliberate design. And then lastly, we have on here, there's a lot of affordances in terms of adaptability and personalization. So we're starting to see, especially in business and industry, there's a lot of opportunities where a lot of our ed tech companies are coming up with different ways to help facilitate content, to push content out to employees or to different learning audiences, as well as being able to provide more immediate and more targeted feedback. We're starting to see where AI, I'm going to use the word remediation, AI can be used to kind of help monitor and support learners' progress over an extended period of time. And so with this, there's a lot of benefits, but of course, we also have to be very careful with how we are using it. And so one of the things that we're going to kind of propose today, Stephanie and I had worked on a conceptual framework a while back to support design deliberations. And so we were really thinking about, what does it mean to be intentional designers? What does it mean to design with intentionality? And really think about, what does all of this mean as we're in this age of AI? And there's so many opportunities to improve upon efficiency and scalability, but there's also so many pitfalls too that we need to be mindful of as we're navigating all of this and trying to figure this out. When we think about AI, I think that we're kind of building the plane while we're trying to fly it. And so again, I think this is where it's even more important that we're engaging in iterative instructional design practice to really be reflecting on what we're doing, what's working, and not being afraid to go back and make modifications along the way. And so within this conceptual framework that we'll talk about today, and we'll give you some tips on ways in which we can apply this today and through some of our different reflective activities, really thinking about how we can leverage generative AI to help us conduct more in-depth learner analysis, as well as engage in what we're calling recursive design deliberations. And so really helping how we can leverage AI to support all of that along the way. Now I'm just kind of showing you, this is what it looks like, and we're going to go through several of these components today, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because we will revisit it. But this is where we're looking at a variety of different things that we'll talk about today. We've got design deliberation, and so if you were thinking about what does that mean by itself, this is where we're looking at the conception, judgment, and inference. And so when we're looking at the conception, this is where we're starting to come up with some of our design ideas. Perhaps we've had a kickoff meeting with a client or our supervisor. We've been given certain orders on what they're looking for a design. Perhaps we're the ones if we've been lucky enough to, I'm going to do a plug for needs assessment because y'all know I love that. Let's say we were able to do a needs assessment and we've identified that training is an appropriate solution. This is where we're starting to conceive that. We're starting to conceive what possible solutions will help us to facilitate learning and improve performance. From there, whenever we're engaged in design, we're always engaging in a series of decisions and judgments. And I think that I love talking about design judgments with instructional designers, because every time that you do that, if we were to keep a log of every design decision that we make, we're probably missing so many other decisions because we just do it so intuitively. But again, for any project that we've all worked on, if you just thought of one project that you worked on yesterday, you've probably made, I bet you, at least 20 to 50 design decisions. And some of those probably aren't even accounted for because it just becomes habit for you along the way. And so within this, as we're going through these design judgments, this is where we're pulling from design precedent, we're conjecturing, we're pulling from what we currently know about a situation, what we're drawing from our own expertise as instructional designers. And then again, we have to pivot a bit and think about how are we customizing things based on contextual factors, because we all know that instructional design solutions are not a one size fits all. If we go into something with that mentality, we know that we're aiming for a one size fits none. And so it's really important that we're keeping this in mind as we go through. So we're proposing that as we're looking at design deliberation, to start thinking about the localization of context, which we'll talk a little bit more about. When we look at a lot of the seminal work in contextual analysis, it dates back to the 1990s. And while a lot of that is still very relevant for what we do as instructional designers, there has been more conversations over the last 6 years, led by some researchers in our field, about what does it mean to localize this context. And so we'll get to that point as well. And so if you look over to this right here, where we've got frame the problem, manage the design space, exploring potential benefits and harms, this is not intended to be a prescriptive framework or model. If anyone has read stuff by, especially written by me or Stephanie, you know that we don't think that we need more models in the field, but I think how we can use models and how we can engage in design practices is really important. And so this is not meant that you would follow this in a linear process, step by step by step. But again, this is meant to serve as a blueprint, to serve as a guide along your design adventures. And so when we think about what is deliberative design, when we look at just the definition, it's showing that everything is grounded in careful thought, reflection, and judgment. And I think that this is so important if we think about what we do as instructional designers. Everything we do all of these things, or we should be doing all of these things. We should be engaged in careful thought. We talk a lot about the importance of engaging in reflective practice or reflection in action. And then, of course, the design judgments and all that decision making, and being able to take that step back and think about how are we making decisions that are aligning with what our learners' unique needs are. And so this goes beyond the traditional design by, again, by pulling in some more intentionality, thinking about what we know about the cognitive process with our design decisions, being more situationally aware of what those decisions may be. And then, of course, looking at the ethical engagement. How are we doing right by our learners? And what steps and what mechanisms are we putting into place into our design practices to ensure that we're doing that? And so one of the things that we really want to emphasize today, and if you don't remember anything from this workshop by the end of this week, if you've had a long week, please think about it this way. Deliberative design is an intentional act of exercising care in design. And I really like that phrasing of it's exercising care. And so if we think about that, if we think about our learners as real people and not just necessarily widgets or people that we'll never see, depending on where we work, if we think of them as real human beings and we're trying to help them, if we think about how are we exercising care in design, how are we putting the learner at the center of everything that we do, how are we being ethical with the decisions that we're making when we're leveraging different tools, or we're thinking about what needs to be in place to best support them. This is how we exercise care in design. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides about how we're going to do that in this particular topic today with generative AI and accessibility. And so when we look at why is deliberation needed when using generative AI, again, there's a lot of opportunities for us to be able to conduct certain instructional design tasks very quickly, much quicker than it used to when we didn't have these tools available. But we can't rely on them and assume that everything that's being pumped out of these tools is accurate. While there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of it, we still need to have that instructional designer's critical eye. We still need to be thinking about what does this look like just in terms of just basic good instructional design practices, but also how is this aligning and supporting the unique context that we're designing for. And so one of the things that you can be thinking about is that the output is only as good as the input. You know, these generative AI tools are not human beings. They are relying on massive data sets, both good, bad, and the ugly. One example that we wanted to call to attention, Chuck Hodges had done a series of experiments playing around with some generative AI tools. And of course, there was a lot that were coming out where a lot of the outputs were coming out boasting about how learning styles is so important in the instructional design practices. And so right away, if you see that, you're probably going, no, no, no. And so again, this is an example of, garbage in, garbage out. And so again, we need to be really mindful of what are some of these inputs that are being put into these systems, especially knowing that they're continuing to evolve and that a lot of people are putting in different content. But again, we have to be careful that we're not just relying solely on what these outputs are generating, because if we do that, then we run the risk of reinforcing misconceptions, biases, and ableist assumptions in instructional design. And so it's really important that, again, we keep reflecting back, we keep that critical eye. And again, I'm going to say, talking about, yeah, I see Lisa's talking about that. Yeah, learning styles is a myth. But again, we'll kind of be looking at the ways in which we should be looking at this in terms of good instructional design practices, as well as what does it mean for our unique learner needs. And then, of course, we talk about deliberation and action. And this is very much a play off of reflection and action. This is a term that Schoen's been talking about for years, since the 1980s, thinking about how we're describing a conversation with the problem as it unfolds. Jason McDonald has done a lot of work talking about reflection and action and what does that mean as instructional designers as we engage in our process, in our design processes. And so again, if we're thinking about it, it's just this ongoing evaluation and willingness to adjust and pivot during that design process. So as you think about, as more information becomes available to us, as different contextual factors may change, or there may be things that just happen to pop up that perhaps weren't there during that initial kickoff meeting, reflection and action allows us to be able to make the necessary changes. And so what we're doing is, our spin is talking about thinking about the ways in which we can be more deliberate with our decision making. Now, Tracy and Baki were talking about this when they were writing about reflection and action, talking about what does this look like? This is where we start questioning assumptions. This is where we're deciding on design action, reflecting on its consequences, and adapting based on insights. And I think that this is really timely as we're looking at what does it mean for generative AI, and we're looking at what are the affordances with generative AI. And so if I'm starting to look at what some of those outputs are, if I'm an instructional designer, perhaps I want to come up with a case study or an activity for one of my classes, and I'm typing in some prompts. This is where Tracy and Baki's list of iterative ID behaviors is really important and really critical to that process, because it's requiring me to really think about how intentional am I being as a designer, as an educator, and what are the implications of some of these design decisions that I'm making. And so the other thing, when we think about learner analyses, the realities are that we have a really hard time as a field convincing people to let us do learner analyses or to let us do needs assessments. And so I think some of the things, I won't get on my soapbox about how we need to come together and keep advocating for these things, but we need to be realistic of this. If you're a K-12 teacher and you are working with the same set of students over an extended period of time, you have the luxury of being able to get to know them very well and to get more comfortable with understanding what their needs are, so that as you're working with them throughout a school year, you can adapt and pivot. And I think depending on the size of your classes and what your program structure looks like and your roles within programs in higher ed, there are times where we have the same opportunities. If I'm working with a couple of students over a 2 or 3 year period in a master's program, I have that opportunity to get to know them and to see how they're evolving in their coursework. Now, that's a lot harder to do if I'm teaching an undergraduate course and I've got 400 or 500 students in there. Unfortunately, it's going to be really hard to be able to customize. We see even greater challenges when we're looking at business and industry. If we're designing off the shelf courses, there are times where we barely know who that potential learning audience is going to be, just because of how things are set up. And so some of the things that happen is it requires us to engage in conjecturing. And so this is where we have to start making assumptions about our learners. We have to pull in from what limited information do we have available. This is again where we're pulling in from our previous design precedent. I worked several years in healthcare, And I got really good at, you could bring me to a healthcare event and I could meet someone and I could probably guess what the physician's specialty was after talking to them for 2 or 3 minutes about work, because I had gotten used to and comfortable with working with them. And so again, there's times where we have to pull in and start making assumptions based on what we know and previous experiences. But again, these assumptions that we make can sometimes oversimplify learner diversity, which leads to designs that do not meet the needs of all students. And so one of the things that we're constantly doing, is we're constantly managing design tensions. And I think we do this on every project. And I think sometimes design tensions have a negative connotation to it. But I do think that this is where this is the part of our jobs that I like. And this is the part that I find exciting, because it reminds us that instructional design is not that one size fits all. And this is where it's so important that we are coming in with that critical eye. And so the risk of assumptions is we don't want to generalize and assume that all of our learners are the same. Because again, if we were aiming for that one size fits all, we're going to get a one size fits none. We also don't want to overlook varied needs, recognizing that individuals' learners' needs, especially when we start talking about accessibility, can vary drastically. So again, we don't want to assume that everyone with accessibility needs is the same and that their needs are the same, and that, and that we have this prescriptive formula for how we're going to address this. And so we have to have this design tension that arises where we have to balance the need to advocate for learner data, trying to get as much information on our learners as we can, while we also have to make sure that we're maintaining project momentum. And so we know that oftentimes we're faced with working on design projects and we can't always go to our manager or our client and say, can we pause this project so we can conduct a thorough needs assessment over the next 3 to 4 months? We want to talk to everyone. That's not realistic. And so again, we have to start thinking about what and finding ways in which we can mitigate the risks so that we're not hindering the quality and inclusivity of our designs. And so this is that balancing act in terms of what questions are we able to ask? How do we engage in that iterative design practice, reflection and action? As new information becomes available, we take a few steps back, look at what we've got going on, where do we need to adjust and pivot? And then again, just thinking about what is just good basic instructional design principles we should be adhering to throughout our work. And so this now kind of leads us to, as we're thinking about, if you look at that, if you remember back on that conceptual framework we showed you briefly, which we will come back to, this is where we start looking at what does it mean to shift to a localization of context. And so again, when we think about the seminal writings on contextual analysis in our field from the 90s, it's very much talking about the importance of balancing the orienting context, the instructional context, and the transfer context. And so the orienting context is really thinking about who are our learners? What are their predispositions and goals when they're approaching or getting ready to participate in a learning experience? The instructional context is where, how is the information going to be delivered? How is it going to be designed? What instructional strategies are we going to have? What expectations are we setting in terms of what's the learner's role and what's the instructor's role? And then we have to be thinking about, and how does that fit in within our overall organization's learning culture? And then lastly, we have the transfer context. And this is thinking about, how are our learners going to apply whatever it is that they're learning during this learning experience in the real world? So instructions complete, they leave us, and then they go off to continue on in their worlds. How are they leveraging what they've learned? How are they applying it? Are they applying it correctly? Do they have the necessary resources and support mechanisms in place to be able to do that? Just to show in the chat, which context do you think is the most difficult for us to get information on as designers? Is it the orienting context, the instructional context, or transfer context? You just want to type one of those three in the chat. I'm always just curious to see what people think. I'm seeing a few of my former UGA students in here and they're typing the correct answer. So I'm happy about that. Thank you. And so again, it's the transfer context. Unless we have a longitudinal relationship with our learners and we're able to see what they're doing, that's where we're able to see some of this transfer occurring. I've joked with my students before. I said, you know, if we were really looking at the transfer context, it would be like me showing up where you work maybe 6 months to a year out after you graduate and start seeing how are you applying what you've been taught in our program. But again, that's really hard for us to do. And so again, as we're trying to think about, we want the instruction that we're designing to be relevant to them. And we want our learners to see the value in what they're experiencing and what they're receiving. And so in the user experience design research, if we look at human computer interaction, they've talked about this idea of localizing context and really thinking about how is the learner going to explore or navigate an experience. And so in recent years, Monica Tracy and John Bakke have really started thinking about what does localization of context look like in instructional design. And so what they're suggesting is, again, we're going to start approaching things thinking of the learner context. How is the learner navigating through that experience? And then also thinking about the designer context. How is that designer making those necessary adjustments and pivoting along the way as more information becomes available? And so it kind of changes the way in which we look at the orienting, instructional, and transfer context literature. I think in some ways, sometimes I feel like the learner and the there's some distance between with the learner and the designer. And I think when we think about this idea of localization of context, Tracy and Bakke are saying let's put the designer and put the learner up front and really think about how are they both navigating through these experiences. And so within this framework, we're kind of looking at it in a way in terms of how do we build upon that? So how do we think about how that learner is going to navigate through that orienting, instructional, and transfer context? And how is the designer navigating through this as well? And then as we go through our examples today, we'll talk about this in terms of how we're going to do this in the context of leveraging generative AI to support accessibility. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie now, who's going to start walking us through some of the different ways we can engage in specific activities.
Yeah, thank you, Jill, for such a great overview and introduction. And I think as I get going on this, pardon me for violating a mayor principle here, talking about something that's not on the slide. But so Jill and I put a paper together on using generative AI for accessibility, and we explored a specific scenario in that of using Chat GPT to help develop a more accessible plan for an online learning class. And we have, of course, headed into it with these ideas. We were bringing together both of our work on design practices, context, contextual analysis, needs analysis, et cetera, as well as ethics, and bringing all of that to bear. And as we put Chat GPT through its paces, it became very clear to us that, what we were getting out of it, it was that garbage in, garbage out sort of situation. And so we were tinkering with, okay, how do we get it to give us better information? I worked many years ago as a lead instructional designer for a national center on low incidence disabilities. This was before we had most of the checklists and things like that that are around today. Amy may be the only person who may know some of these references, but we had like Bobby as accessibility checker and things like that. But we were still trying to figure out how do we make all of this accessible. And so I think it was because of those years of experience and having to think through the process that as we were looking at the output together, Jill and I were like, yeah, this is actually really shallow. It's not very helpful. It's not getting us to real solutions, things like that. And so that's clearly where the deliberation was coming in. And so as we put that paper together, we were also trying to think through what are some specific deliberation activities, right? So now we're going to start trying to drill down into what are specific things that we as designers can do in our practice. There's some great ideas already being shared over in the chat window. I'm going to call out a few things that I've seen go by real quick, but there was a question about needs assessment and being specific. And I think it was Jason Bach who raised the use of personas and using personas to help think about who our learners are and frame them. And Amy shared a resource over there on incorporating accessibility into learner personas as part of that process. So make sure you scroll the chat area and snag that. We should also snag that, by the way, maybe Elisa, and drop that over into our resource document for folks. So that's a great resource. So some of the different ways that we can engage in deliberation and practice early on. And so just a little bit more clarity. My main body of work is on ethics and ed tech. And we put Heather Tailberg Webb and I have a book out on ethics and educational technology with a framework for that that starts with reflection and action, just like Jill was talking about, and incorporates work by Vanessa Sfila on problem framing. So Sfila, Vanessa, she's my colleague here at UNM, has done a ton of work on problem framing. And I love how she defines problem framing. She says, this is the process by which we as designers take ownership of a problem. And this is how we start to make judgments on what is included or excluded in any given design solution. So the point here being that accessibility or inclusive design has to be framed in from the get-go as part of the problem that we're working on. So for example, I used to do a ton of work in online learning and development. I could frame that work as I need to develop online learning and make sure that that's available for folks. I can also frame what I'm working as I want to design and develop online learning that is accessible, as accessible as possible to all learners. And so by doing that, I'm starting to frame accessibility into the problem space, which means I'm going to start exercising design judgments, right? On, okay, this is the problem that I want to solve, then I'm going to derive solutions that help me actually address that problem. So there's that intentionality around problem framing, right? Taking ownership and deciding to exercise on that. With ethical analysis, we tried to introduce this idea of ethical analysis by way of a paper in Tech Trends. John Curry loved it. That matters to any of you. And what we're really talking about here is right now. So I've studied ethics for over 20 years in the field, and I'm glad to see an explosion on it. But I think my biggest concern right now is that people seem to be just saying we need to think about ethics and then list ethical issues. And most of it really focuses on naming issues. And frankly, a lot of ethics scholarships goes, especially ethics and design and applied ethics, goes well beyond that. And so we introduced a tool and an approach of ethical analysis of identifying both potential benefits and potential harms. So not just not just naming potential harms, but also thinking about potential benefits. I think the way that we've put this workshop together today really exemplifies that. And so not just thinking about what are some of the issues with generative AI, but also how can we leverage it? What are the ways in which we can actually benefit our learners through using that? And so then that gets framed into the problem process as well. Certainly incorporating multiple perspectives. I just finished up a study with Ahmed Lakab and Victoria Abramaka Lakab, who's here today. So hi, Victoria. We just finished up a study that just got accepted that's on how designers integrate ethics into their practice. One of the big ways that designers do this is by involving multiple perspectives. So any form of stakeholder involvement, bringing multiple voices into the conversation, in some ways this goes back to the mantra for accessibility, nothing about us without us, right? How are we involving our learners in the process and creating space for their voices? So it's not just your agency as a designer, but how are you sharing that agency out and distributing that agency with others through your design practices? And then even reflecting on your own ethical influence. I think we're starting to reflect on that more and talk about that more as a field. It's been a very long, dry time. But it's nice to see folks talking about coming at our work from, say, a principles-based approach of, equity or inclusion or diversity. Or it's nice to see folks coming from like a care-based perspective as well. And so evoking those ethical perspectives that may be latent or explicit, but then really becoming more intentional about how we do that and how we're going to fold that into our design practices. Okay, next slide, Beth. So those are early stage. Those are things we can do at the front end. In terms of ongoing, certainly engaging in nonlinear design, where, of course, I think most of us know this from practice. We maybe, learn or design models sort of unintentionally convey the sense that design is very linear, but in reality, it's highly nonlinear, very iterative. And so, just like Jill was talking about with the idea of reflection and action, the way that reflection and action functions is as this sort of reflective, iterative loop that designers use throughout. And I'm going to give you an example later on after Amy goes through some tools of, how do designers actually use reflection and action as a specific design activity. Navigating these dual contexts. So designers are always balancing expectations with learner-centered customization and then managing the tension between these spaces. Design space surveillance is ongoing evaluation of time, budget, technology, and the learner context. And we're always navigating the tensions between those. I'm working on a project right now with Noah Glaser where we've been interviewing designers out in the field. And repeatedly, designers, of course, are always talking about how they navigate these various tensions and how they're having to make decisions about say accessibility or other design considerations in context of time, budget, platform, things like that. I think we all know that like the LMS that you might use, for example, greatly informs and can constrain some of your practices. And then, of course, generative AI support. AI can enable rapid prototyping and the creation of some contextualized and adaptive content. But again, I think what Jill and I have really discovered is that you really have to lean on what generative AI is going to give you to bring your professional body of knowledge and practice to bear in order to yield a desirable result for your learners and for your context. Okay, Beth. So some various reflective deliberative activities that we see designers using. Sustainable design thinking, so reflecting on what's the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the ease of learning can help guide some of those ethical or at least inform that. Certainly addressing AI concerns. A number of folks, like I said, like this is such a short list of citations here for that. But a lot of folks, of course, are writing on AI's limitations and biases. UNESCO has some out there. That more et al. Piece down there too. I worked with a colleague who works in AI to raise some of that. There's some good summaries out there of what those concerns are. I think rather than treating, lately I've been thinking our discourse on ethics of AI feels more like a game of spades, where people are trying to figure out what trump card to throw down to like sort of end the conversation, right? That, oh, well, I see your point and I raise you this consideration or whatever. What's really interesting for folks who study ethics in other fields, especially other design fields, is that they don't take this approach of ethics as dichotomous, that raising an ethical issue isn't simply a matter of deciding yes or no, but rather they're raising them as considerations, right? Just like we fold other kinds of considerations in, ethical issues become different constraints that we're trying to navigate. And we may not be able to perfectly optimize towards one or multiple. And sometimes ethical considerations are even in real tension with each other. I often talk about like confidentiality and transparency are a good example. You can't optimize transparency without sacrificing confidentiality and vice versa. So as designers, we're always trying to figure out what is really the best solution here. And that doesn't mean that it's a perfect solution. So with that, I'm going to call out Amy's wonderful chapter in our book on applied ethics on trying to disabuse ourselves of the myth of trying to obtain perfection with accessibility. And that's with Rebecca, who's over here too in the chat. So certainly remaining aware of AI's limitations and biases, and then folding that into your considerations. And I'll give you an example later of how some designers did that. Beyond the technical, oh, sorry, if you can go back. Going beyond technical reflection, so certainly considering economic, social, systemic. For me, as a ethics scholar, like these are all different aspects of ethical considerations, whether you're coming at this from like a social responsibility sort of perspective or principles-based orientation, but really thinking beyond just the technical features and getting into some of the other systemic aspects. And then finally, documenting your process. We see time and time again from designers how they keep journals and they come back to those and they engage with those journals as reflections, or maybe if they're working in a team, like they keep notes and they have times that they come back together as a team to actively reflect on how things are going, how they need to adjust. And so keeping records of those decisions, but then also layering on a practice of intentional reflection and action is a key reflective deliberative activity. So, okay, I think we've talked to you for quite a bit. Thanks for putting that link in there, Amy. We need to add that to the resources too. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through an activity on framing accessibility as a learning problem. Yeah, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Beth. So one of the early deliberation activities that I mentioned is problem framing. I think I could talk about problem framing for days, and I fangirl over Vanessa Svila's work on this day in and day out. So go ahead, Beth. Accessibility in so much of our literature is often framed as a technical or legal problem. There's a great piece by Michelle Estes and Lloyd Reber that came out, I think, in 2017 on reframing accessibility, where they took a look at some of the design models and how they talked about accessibility. They mainly referenced Dick and Carey, but in Dick and Carey, the only reference to accessibility is that you should be Section 508 compliant. So it was very much a compliance or legal sort of orientation. I took that a step further in a paper on the design models we have are not the design models we need. Yeah, if we can go back, Beth. Sorry. No, stop right there. Sorry. So when in looking at the Morrison et al., yeah, Lloyd, of course, is really into this. If you look at like the Morrison et al., the only reference to accessibility is that those learners are not our problem, and it's actually pretty problematic framing in the text. And that's largely the framing that we have around accessibility in the major texts in the field. So the work that folks like Amy and Michelle and Rebecca and others, Patrick's been doing some great work too, Patrick Lowenthal, around accessibility. These are huge leap forwards for us to rethink how we are framing accessibility. So what happens when we reframe accessibility as a learning problem rather than a technical or a legal problem? We can start to bring to bear all of our knowledge on different learning theories to accessible design and decision making. And this can really change the design space for us. So, for example, okay, Beth. Thank you. If we looked at, if we framed or defined accessible learning just through cognitive theories alone, right? Like I'm just going to toy with that for a moment. Cognitive theories, of course, relate to information processing, cognitive load, selection and integration and organization. When I used to design, when I was a designer for the National Center on Low Incidence Disabilities, we were constantly asking ourselves, can the learner actually make sense of this information? Does a learner who's using a screen reader or a Braille keyboard have access to the same learning opportunities as other learners? Are we helping them process information? So, for example, we were testing everything with one of our students who was mostly blind, and she used a Braille keyboard output. And I'm going to date our web design practices very quickly here, but this was when frames were all the thing in web design. And so with frames, you would have like a header and then a sidebar and then your main content area usually. But the way that frames function was they were like 3 separate web pages all in one. So when we sat down with the student to see how she was navigating our site, we realized she was spending an inordinate amount of time reprocessing the information in the header and in the sidebar with the menu, even though that information never changed. And so she was spending equal parts on navigation as she was on the content, like what we actually wanted her focused on for learning. So we kind of brainstormed with her. And in the context of the tools we had at the time, we said, what if we embedded a quick message in each of the frames that only the screen reader or the Braille keyboards would pick up on that said, none of this information is going to change. Like once you read it, you can ignore it. And so when we did that, we dropped in this little, like I said, just a little hidden message just for blind users. She suddenly was so much more efficient in her use of that site, right, and navigating it. And she was spending almost all of her cognitive load, right, all of her cognitive capacity on processing the actual learning content that we wanted her to focus on, right? So by just one little thing, we can reduce the cognitive load and actually help a student shift their precious capacity resources over to the main content. Alt text and captioning and subtitle, like all of the accessibility tools that we've got in our toolkit work the same way. So a lot of times, like an alt text isn't just there to say, this is what this is, right? But we're trying to convey information to the user through those alt text. So that's why like having an arrow that says arrow isn't actually all that useful. But if you've got an arrow and the point of that arrow is go to the next slide, then go to the next slide is more useful, right? As alt text. So if we're approaching accessibility, not just through the lens of checking a technical text box, but we as instructional designers are doing what we do, and we start to think about how am I facilitating learning? How am I facilitating meaning making through this? How am I facilitating access to information? Then we start to frame the work that we're doing as facilitating accessible learning. Okay, exactly, Amy. I swear, as a designer, sitting down with 1 or 2 students who are representative and just observing and conversing with them, and then even brainstorming ideas with them, those are the most meaningful activities I think I've engaged in my design career. And personally, they just changed me as a designer. So some early deliberation activities, go ahead. I'm going to keep toying with this idea of reframing accessibility a little bit. So if we bring in like socio-cognitive theories, right, where now we're starting to think about social aspects of learning, interactions are necessary to learning, technical or legal accessibility solutions can actually cut learners out of that active meaning-making process. So one non-example I have is from very early in my career. We met with a large learning management system provider. I'm not going to name names here. But at the time, their chat tool was not accessible at all. So of course, their technical legal compliance orientation to making it accessible and being legally compliant was that any student would have access to the transcripts at the end of a discussion. Now, I think for most of us, I hope we would look at that and say, that's lovely, but that means that that learner doesn't get to actively participate in the meaning making process. They're only a consumer of what others have produced, right? And so we want looking at accessibility through this socio-cognitive. Now we're starting to think about, no, we want learners to be able to actively participate in that meaning making process. So I hope this is prompting you to start thinking about how you are framing your accessibility practices. So go ahead, Beth. Of course, in online and digital environments, we've got the framework of community of inquiry. Very common one. At the core of that are all of these types of interaction, right? We want learners to interact with the content in meaningful ways. We want them to interact with each other. We want them to interact with the instructor. And so for me, as I work on accessibility, and whether as an instructional designer or director of instructional design, like I'm always kind of ticking through these layers of interaction and trying to think about how are the learners, how's learner content interaction going to be accessible? How is learner interaction going to be accessible? How is learner instructor interaction going to be accessible? Okay, Beth. So over in the chat window, I hope that this is starting to prompt some ideas from you guys. So let me start with just this question. What are other ways we might frame accessibility as a learning problem? And I'm going to pause to see what you generate here. Right, spoiler alert. Accessibility is a human problem and a learning problem. Is this prompting any thoughts for you guys? Or are you feeling like, oh gosh, maybe I was a little stuck on thinking of accessibility as a technical problem or legal problem?
Sorry, I thought you wanted us to go to the shared document, so I was just clicking over there. But I was just gonna,
yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Sure. So in terms of the other sort of learning problem is I think that there's a lot of, Amy keeps saying, you know, nothing about us without us, right? So there's also this notion around all of the many contributions that the disability community themselves has actually contributed to learning, to society, to all of those things. So I think there's also the notion around disability as content, disability history and contributions as content that I think is also sort of a learning problem, not just that like outside instructional designers are the saviors, but what has that community actually done in their contribution?
Exactly. Kim, I love that. And so I think we have a long ways to go, right? In continuing to learn from that. And your comment, so I was doing a workshop with Elizabeth Bowling. So shout out to the Indiana, to the Bloomington crew that's here today. I saw you making comments. And we were talking about some of this to some extent, and Elizabeth made a comment that just has stuck with me. She said, you know, we were talking about the designer presence in design. Like so many of our models even scrub the presence of us as designers and, you know, our perspectives, our ethical orientations, things like that, you know, our cultural backgrounds, everything that we bring, our models kind of scrub all of that out. And so we were talking about the designer presence and that had been sparked by an earlier conversation and some work by Elizabeth Bowling. So Heather and I even dedicated a chapter to that in our book. But as we were talking during this workshop, Elizabeth says, I don't think we're ready for what's next. And that's the notion that the designer is not at the center of design. And so I think that comes right back to it, right? Like in some ways, we're just starting to recognize that we have a presence in the design process. And in some cases, I feel like that, it looks like that's led to a sort of centering of the designer. But, Elizabeth's point is very well taken that we don't actually sit at the center of this. We are designing with, right, and in context. So the context matters. Who we're designing for matters. Who we're designing with matters. And design is always a process of negotiation, right? And so we're negotiating not just various considerations like, how the learning is going to happen, but we're also negotiating those perspectives and trying to figure out how to all of those. So it's not that we and our perspective is at the center, but rather that there are all of these different perspectives that we have to negotiate. And that's the really hard work of design, but that's also the very real work of design. So yeah, going back to this idea of nothing about us without us, how do we create that table for, or that those venues or mechanisms for more people to be part of that process? And how do we truly move from just design that you're directing to more to processes like participatory design or even emancipatory design? Like there are a lot of great design tools and methods that other fields in particular have been developing around participatory approaches, stakeholder engagement, things like that, that you can certainly fold into our practices. Exactly, Robin. And Kim, right. So I think one of the tools we can take away from today, right, is this idea of co-creation, of co-design, right, of participation in our design practices. And that's such a great way of reframing accessibility as a learning problem, that this is a shared space. So based on that, what might be the implications for our use of generative AI for learning, especially as that relates to accessibility? Asking for a little brainstorming here. Right, Victoria, I know the technical and the legal framing are so pernicious, right? They're pervasive and they're pernicious. They just sort of crop in there. So, and I feel like this is something where it's not just us as a profession of instructional designers can, say, oh, we need to be better about this as our practices. But frankly, I feel like this is a space where we can bring some of our professional knowledge to bear on accessibility and make some really interesting and important contributions.
I'll just add, kind of going off of Kim's point as well, thinking about the work that generative AI brings to light. Does that involve people with disabilities? Historically, the work has not been included in mainstream everything. And so is AI able to bring that to light when you're asking or when you're prompting different questions? The answer is probably not. So as designers, we have to know that and recognize that and be able to bring those scholars and bring the research and bring the perspectives of people with disabilities, even if AI is not generating that for you. We have to be critical in our analysis of it.
So let me tick through a couple of the comments here. Yeah. So Jason, you know that most designers and teams are stuck in a bureaucracy, which requires you to worry more about the legal issues. Totally. Like that, I feel like that's a summary of my career. And so when I worked at University of Northern Colorado, I was there for a long time. We started very simply by saying we're going to test our site and we're going to start developing standards for excellence that incorporate accessibility. Eventually, what we did was we actually reached out to the main IT and web team at the university to start trying to promote more accessible websites across the university. There, fortunately, we had a very willing partner. And so we worked with them to develop, like, what are some of what do we consider excellence in this space? We even recommended that they develop like a testing station where they could bring students in, run things through with them, see what's going on. Because we were like, you have to see it. You have to be able to see the barriers that students are running into, right? In order to really understand this. So change takes time. I would say that was probably about a 5-year process that I just summarized very quickly. And then when I moved to the University of Virginia, my primary task there was to develop online programs. But one of the reasons that they selected me and wanted to bring me there was because of my work on accessibility. That was lovely, but institutionally, bureaucratically, they were really not ready to talk about accessibility. They didn't have infrastructure. When I would talk with folks in certain roles, you know, I would hear those jarring comments of like, well, we don't really have students like that, right? So we had a long way to go on that. And so again, change is a process, not an event, as the change research will say. But so we slowly over time, what we actually did was we built a coalition of instructional designers and directors of ID around campus to say, you know what, we're going to define excellence in online learning. And what we're going to do is use that as a vehicle for accessibility as well. And so we sort of, you know, a bit of a Trojan horse approach here, right? We're going to talk about this is what we mean in terms of educational excellence, and accessibility and inclusive design is part of educational excellence. From there, we actually built a committee, a university-wide committee that was on excellence, and started having more conversations explicitly and intentionally about accessibility as part of that. Eventually, we actually worked with the provost's office to create a position on accessible learning. I forget what Lori's actual official title was. But we got her hired in, and Lori took off and just started doing amazing things like incorporating accessibility into procurement guidelines and expectations and things like that. So I'm not going to say this quick and easy to address bureaucracy. This is where I think that we can draw on the change suite of tools and insights from our field, right? But it is hard and it does take time, but I think we can do that. In terms of ensuring our design practices reach individuals so faculty and staff have an understanding of importance in UDL. Is that too heavy on the cognitive load? So this is where I think we have to think more in terms of organizational, right, design and performance. Is it too much for most faculty to actually take on UDL and accessibility directly in their classes? My honest answer is I think so. Yes, I'm a faculty member who's deeply committed to this. And yet some of the practices that we're going to talk about here with Amy's section, they are difficult to implement. Trying to carve that time out of my hide is extremely difficult. What I need as a faculty member is a support infrastructure. I don't actually need another workshop telling me that this is important or trying to convince me of that. What I need is actual investment in infrastructure and support, right? So maybe that's in the form of tools that help us get that done, which that's what we're going to go into next. Those tools are hugely important. For example, for captioning videos or helping to generate alt text on images or things like that. But if anybody's done an accessibility check on a PowerPoint, for example, you know the limitations of, you know, there's a graphic and it's like picture of X. That's not informative, right? There's still so much work we have to do to turn that into meaningful information. And so can a single faculty member pick up that load for all of their classes and materials? No, that's where I think we absolutely need, you know, organizational supports and infrastructure to help that's on top of faculty awareness and faculty knowledge and commitment. Most faculty I know are aware and are committed. I certainly have worked with some who are not, they're aware, but they're not committed, right? That's a different challenge. But I would say most folks are aware and committed. And so what we really need are support and help. So I rely greatly on our instructional design team here. We have an amazing instructional design team who I think should win all the awards. So, you know, but they're wonderful, and they think about these very things as well. Okay, one last question I'm going to get to. Catherine, you asked, I've utilized Copilot to help faculty improve alt text. Any other ideas? Why, yes, and Amy's going to cover some of those here in just a moment. So, okay, I had one more slide on an early deliberation activity on ethical analysis. So, yeah, Beth, if you could go ahead and click on it just one more time there. There we go. So thinking through what are potential harms and potential benefits. I think I'm going to skim through this one very quickly because I think what I'm gleaning from our conversation over in the chat, my intent with this, again, was to kind of prompt us to get out of only thinking about ethics as harms. Ethics is also about what's good, what's beneficial, right? Like what are the goods that we want to deliver? In fact, one of my favorite books on this right now is called The Goods of Design by Ariel Gerzenzweig, who's in Spain. And I love how he invites us into this conversation about how do we produce good through the design work that we do. Based on your comments, I think we're there. So I'm not going to belabor this point. What I am going to do is go ahead and I think hand it on over to Amy to get us down into even more specifics here.
All right, thank you so much. So I wanted to start, and this actually came up in the chat too, so this was good timing here, but I want to actually ask you all, what does disability and accessibility mean to you? Give us just a few words, a couple of things. Okay, we're getting humanity, very good one. You might be influenced by what we've already been talking about. Throw out some other words and phrases. What is it really about? We were talking, and Stephanie was talking too, about how it's sometimes broad. Okay, we're getting inclusion, mattering. Somebody said regulations, not able to do as easily as a normal person, community, difference, inclusion, universal design. Disability and accessibility doesn't apply individually. Participation, that's a good one. Inclusion, empathy, end of normalcy. I like that. What is normal? All right, cool. So as those keep coming in, back in the day, before AI was a thing, I used to do trainings and I would often start with a question like this. And I'd also ask, do you know anybody with a disability? So do you know anybody with a disability? I'm just asking you all now. Give me a yes, no. Yep. Kim says yes. Lots of yeses in the chat. Awesome. Okay, lots of yeses. Well, if you don't know somebody with a disability, you do now. I have multiple disabilities, and hi, nice to meet you. So back to the, right, all right, Elisa's saying yes as well, hello, right? So back to this nothing, it used to be nothing about us without us, and now the phrase is just nothing without us. So I think it's really important as we start to contextualize and we start to frame accessibility to really understand what it means to everybody and also what it means to disabled people in particular. And I think we had lots of great words. Yep, Stephanie's saying nothing without us. All right, go ahead. We're going to go through a couple of little activities here and then ask you to do your own. So in the essence of Chuck Hodges, I did my own little experiment for this presentation, and I prompted ChatGPT to create an image of students on campus. This is a cartoon-ish image, and we see a bunch of students who are lounging around and kind of walking around what looks to be a campus. What we don't see in the picture is any sort of visible disability. So when we prompted originally just for students on a college campus, immediately people with visible disabilities, at least, were not included in the picture. To me, also, I'm a wheelchair user, and so I look at these, there's a whole lot of steps up to that main building. I have had that personal experience more times than I can count. I bet there's an accessible ramp all the way around, 3 miles down the block and around the back of the building. but to me, doesn't scream inclusivity. It doesn't make me feel welcome. I don't see anybody that looks like me. And so that was with an initial prompting. So go ahead to the next slide, please. So then I switched up my prompt, and I asked for students on a college campus, including students with disabilities. So I had to be very specific there. Interesting, and we're going to get into this tool in particular, I used ASU's Image Accessibility Creator, and we'll post all the links and everything there as well. And that is a really fabulous tool. Normally it is very good. It is very on point with the alt text that it provides. In this case, the alt text for this image was students enjoying various activities on a bustling college campus lawn with brick buildings in the background, featuring elements of inclusion and diversity. What does that even mean? Not the way that I would have written the alt text, right? So what is in this image now that I've prompted it specifically for students with disabilities, Robin saying, wow, yeah. And Elnara, yeah, you're saying AI is also trained by advocates for normalcy. Thank you, Rebecca, for that link. So what is in this image is we now see the same sort of style of people sitting and lounging around on this college campus. And we have two people in wheelchairs. The wheelchair styles are very medical. Personally, does not look anything like an actual wheelchair that I would ever use, or I did back in the day, but my personal wheelchairs do not look like that. There's also seemingly a person with I'm going to say futuristic, maybe looking prosthetic, and the other leg may or may not be missing. It's kind of melded with the leg of the wheelchair. Accurate representations? Probably not. And again, this was prompting now specifically for this. Let's go to the next slide here. So here I asked, I feel like at some point, this was actually a different session, which is probably why it's a different style of image. So in this image, there are 4 people. They look really young. Either I'm getting old, or if these are college kids, they look young. But anyway, there's 2 women in wheelchairs, one man who has crutches, and a person who's sitting, hard to tell if they are in a wheelchair or just sitting on a chair. So then I used Microsoft's alt text, so just in a Microsoft Word document, and it wrote a group of people in wheelchairs smiling. At least one of these people is not in a wheelchair. Maybe the one on the end is also not in a wheelchair, hard to tell. So again, the alt text generators and the generation of images. Oh, I think I missed the prompt. Here I prompted ChatGPT with disabled college students. So again, it just didn't go over very well. And you'd have to do some real prompt, kind of tweaking to enable it, but who has time for that, right? So if this is what AI is giving us in the first place, what do we do about that? How can we, do better without spending an inordinate amount of time? And I think the answer is what we've been talking about all along, is this critical reflection, is the deliberative design and thinking about it, question the assumptions. So when ChatGPT or whatever gives you that as an image, question it. It's okay. Is this the representation that you want to put in your course? So now we'll go into some specific tools and just questions for consideration. So of course, as I just mentioned, you can use ChatGPT, you can use Copilot. I have an image here of Adobe Firefly for videos. So you can use generative AI for creating images and creating videos. I'd love to hear in the chat if there's anything else that you use. What are some tools that you use to create? Midjourney is another good one for images. So when you're using these tools, what are some things that you would consider? What are some questions? How can you challenge those assumptions? So thinking about who's represented, how are disabilities in particular represented? Are they? So Gemini, Rebecca uses, Gemini, Kim uses. In this particular instance, I asked Adobe Firefly to create a video of students on campus. And there were, again, no students with visible disabilities. Of course, it is much harder to convey non-visible disabilities, but there are certain ways to do that, but it's just never the go-to with these. So when you're creating these videos and images for your own courses or for courses you're designing, thinking through, who is really being shown on screen, and is that an accurate representation? So what are some other tools that you all use? Curious. Yeah, AI is very ageist when you ask for images of students. Very true. That's another good point. Canva, Teresa uses. So we're going to have you all contribute to a resource page so that we can kind of collect some of these. All right, let's go on to the next one. All right, so alternative text. So we've seen some examples already of alternative text. And again, you have to have the human in control. So this is an image of Anthology Ally. Full disclosure, I work for Anthology. It was a picture I had. But Ally does help you create alt text. But what's nice about it, and what we've really been very particular about, is that it won't write it for you. You have to approve it. And I think that's essential. So in some other tools, you don't have to approve it. And then you end up with like smiling people in wheelchairs, which was not what the image actually was. So yeah, AI doesn't acknowledge disabled people of color. Yep, you have to explicitly prompt for that. Absolutely. Intersectionality is super important. So thinking through, and this is again the point of AI is not ready to replace us as designers. It's just not going to happen. We have to have the context. So when I was writing the AI for these slides, or when I was writing the alt text for these slides, I specifically put in that the notable issue here is that disabilities are not represented well, and that there are, for the one that was just students on a campus, I put in the alt text that notably students with disabilities are not present. That's what I wanted you to get from the image, is looking at the image and noticing that there aren't people with disabilities represented. That's important context that AI would never have been able to give. I still have a job. So thinking of considerations, does the alt text focus on pertinent information? Sometimes it might be helpful, you have to think about what the rest of the page is. What is the purpose? And sitting with that, reflecting on that image for just a minute. Is it even necessary? So we're going to be doing a research study coming soon, hopefully to be presented at AECT, if it gets accepted. But last year at AECT, I was doing a panel about accessibility, and a colleague was explaining a course that was for K-12 educators, and it had a whole bunch of flamingos. And I'm going to say it was a math course. I'm making that part up. But so it was like Pythagorean theory, flamingo, a squared plus b squared, flamingo. And they flamingos everywhere. They had used they had used an alt text generator to to provide the alt text for those flamingos. And so to a screen reader user, it was just flamingo, flamingo, flamingo. And it was very distracting. And so my blind colleague who was on the panel, shout out to David Gardner, he was like, do the flamingos matter? Right? If they don't matter, maybe we remove them. If they do matter, maybe we describe them more accurately. Is it about their pink color? Is it about the water that they're standing in or the environment that they're in? So yes, AI can tell me it's a flamingo, but it cannot tell me the context right now. So stay tuned, more to come on that research project. It'll be about blind people's perception or screen reader users' perception of alt text and how we can do it better as designers. So again, when you're thinking about alt text, is it pertinent? And perhaps a caption would be helpful for everybody. So when you're talking about things like a bar graph or complex charts or things of that nature, sometimes having that explanation for everybody is actually beneficial. So thinking through that context of what the chart or diagram is showing. So let's go to the next one. Video captions and transcripts. I have a love-hate with with videos. Captioning just takes a long time. This is a screenshot of Kaltura, and there's a video, and then there's the side panel showing the captions, and there's lots of inaccuracies. And so the point of that is, yeah, again, they can't get it right all the time. And we have to be the ones in there to talk about, are the captions accurate? Is what's happening on the screen accurately described? So do you need something else to tell you that, the faculty member is pouring chemical A into chemical B. Like, there could be more to it. Are we conveying that information to Stephanie's point, like the community of inquiry? Are the learners able to engage with the content in the way that you want them to, the way that you're intending them to? And there's lots of tools out there. One I will call out is Camtasia. So Camtasia actually has a way where you can add words to the dictionary, I'm going to say, library. I don't know what they call it, but you can add words ahead of time. So my previous institution had a funky name that was not recognized by any institution. I'm also from New York. I say things like coffee and dog. It happens. And so AI doesn't always pick that up. AI is also terrible with anyone with an accent of any kind. So thinking outside of the United States, any other accents are generally not picked up well. But tools like Camtasia, for example, you can add in words that you know that you're going to say and may not be pronounced correctly. Even something like AECT, it may not pick up because it's not a common thing. They may try to spell it as something else. So using tools to support as much as you can. Does anyone use other tools for video captions and transcript? I have Blackboard Video Studio, Kaltura, Otter AI, Panopto is a big one. Yep. How are yep, Panopto, lots of folks there. Captions and transcripts are not something I would start with if you're working with faculty and trying to get buy-in. They are challenging. They are very difficult to get right. That's where that team sport comes in. If you have graduate assistants, if you have students that can help, if you have support from instructional design or whomever it may be to help with that lift, that is generally a better way to go. Rev, yep. There's different companies that will caption for you as well and make sure they're accurate. Things to think about in there. Yeah, Jason says he takes the non-punctuated YouTube captions into GPT to generate a better transcript. Yeah, that's a great idea. And then you can repost that. YouTube went away with, they used to have where you could do community contributions to captioning, but I guess people abused that and you can no longer do that. But you could always reach out to the author of the video and suggest that they, take your file and upload it. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, so now we have content creation. So in general, we can use AI to create text, to create rubrics, to create test questions, assignments. So in this image, I have an image of Blackboard Ultra with the AI generated assignment. You can also generate modules, you can generate rubrics, test questions, all of that. But there's lots of things to consider. So going back to even cognitive load, or construct relevance when we're talking about assessments, are you testing what you actually intend to test, right? Or did the AI create something that maybe has additional layers? It could be cultural layers, it could be other things that are going to contribute to not having plain English or plain language in general that people could easily understand and understand what you are actually testing. We talked a little bit before about generating a case study. If you're generating a case study, are the stories and the people represented, are they stereotypes? Or are they accurate? Are they diverse? Do they include people with disabilities? And to, I think it was Jason's point earlier, intersectionality, Kim was talking about that as well. So do they accurately represent, that disability goes across all identities? Is that accurately represented? So when you're using these tools, it's sort of a starting point, but it should never be an end point. And I think that's where we talk about exercising care. As designers, that is our role, to exercise care and design for real humans. We have to acknowledge that, we are all different and that's okay. There is no normal. And we have to critically think through these pieces of content that we are creating. All right, now it's time for the fun. So you all, we can go to the next slide. We want you to take a few minutes now and we're going to do an activity. So I want you to go off, don't go too far, but go off and use an AI tool of your choice. It could be one of the ones that we mentioned. It could be one that you're familiar with. It could be in your learning management system. It could be, something else that you use. Create a video, write alt text, caption a video that you may already have. Just do the quick version, right? And then we're going to come back and talk about it. You could create content, go to ChatGPT and create, tell it to talk about a subject and see what happens. And then we're going to come back and we're going to reflect on your experiences. And I think Beth is going to play some music while we do this. Yes, Rebecca, do your homework. Oh, it stops playing if you change the window. So we're going to watch waterfalls. We're going to come back and reflect on this after this activity, so be sure to stay with us. All right, maybe no music. Concentrate, people. You can do this.
It keeps turning off. but oh
That's
well.
all right. We tried. Let us know in the chat what you're using. We're introducing. Do we want to do like a 5-minute? We'll say we'll come back at 12:30. 1.
Yeah, 12:30.
Can you go back a slide, Beth? There you go. So the activity is to use a tool of your choice and create something, and with accessibility in mind. So maybe create it first, see what the prompt gives you. Ask for, an image that you would be normally asking for, an image of doctors, an image of, nurses, or an image of teachers in a classroom, right? And then we finish at 1, so it's another half hour. So go ahead and create something. See if it includes people with disabilities, kind of think through the assumptions. Where did it get the information? Is it accurately representing people? Is it being stereotypical? And then try maybe a few prompts to see if you can get it to a more accurate state.
Or if you had brought a piece of content as the instructions had asked, you could try to modify
Use that.
or use that to modify it to make it more accessible.
Maybe you already have some content that had images. You can use one of the alt text generators, whether it's Microsoft or the one that Rebecca put the link in. Maybe we can grab that link again.
I think that we've been adding the links to the shared document. So maybe we can put the shared document in the chat again.
Yeah. Use an accessibility checker, see if that's accurate. Did it miss something? However you would like to do. Get your hands dirty. Jason's got one hand in the air. See, there you go. AI doesn't require me to use my hands. As somebody with mobility issues, I will tell you, true fact, I use AI to type things for me when typing gets to be too complicated. Oh, interesting. Didn't work well. Okay. ChatGPT created well-structured alt text. Nice. If I put a prompt, oops, I missed it. If I put a prompt to create an image using AI, wouldn't that prompt work as alt text? So maybe, but it would really depend on the context and how excellent your prompt was. So for example, my prompt was students on a campus. That probably wouldn't make great alt text given the context I was trying to convey, that the image generated by ChatGPT showed quote unquote normal, right, which doesn't exist, but didn't include people with disabilities, right? It showed very stereotypical young folks without any visible disabilities and limited diversity in general. So that wouldn't be, students on campus wouldn't be great alt text in that case. Oh, Ashley's saying the difference between ChatGPT and Gemini is outstanding.
Astounding, not outstanding.
Oh, it's astounding. Which one was better? I'm curious, Ashley. ChatGPT did a good job. Okay, Jason shared a thread. Thank you. Depends if you pay for ChatGPT. Very true. Okay, ChatGPT worked better than Gemini, right? And all of this is changing constantly. So as designers, sharing this information, collaborating with each other, talking about this is so important. We as a community have to support each other and learn what tools work and what the limitations are so that we can take that into consideration in our own designs. So Ashley, that alt text is pretty long. And going back to cognitive load, is all of that detail the point of that image? It would depend on your context. Copilot is interesting. I love that you're all testing these out. This is perfect. So interestingly, Ashley, your two examples from ChatGPT and Gemini definitely have a different level of detail, but I'm still not sure what the point of the image was, and I don't know that I can guess your prompt from this. It's very vague. So they're engaged in an activity. They're wearing badges. I don't really know what any of that means, right? So if that was the only information I had about the image, I'm not sure I'd be able to follow what's happening. Focal ML, okay. Turned off captioning because it used my tweaked text to make the pronunciation work. Okay, Copilot's not bad. The more detail you put in, the better. Sometimes I think AI is a fun rabbit hole to go down, but you still have to tweak it. Could you write the alt text yourself and have it more on point in terms of context? I like it as a starting point, and then I laugh at it and change it up a little bit. Yeah, so Ashley pasted in a lot of text, lots of stuff happening in there. So if you're using, that might be a long description because that would not be alt text. Alt text generally short and sweet. If you need something this long, you could do a long description, or maybe, in the text surrounding, say this is an LMS page. If there's something that you really need to point out, you may want to do that, in the text around the image for everybody's benefit. So what is the best way to do alt text when describing an image used in biology when the students need to identify the image? So the alt text isn't giving away the answer. Great question, Marjorie. And I think the answer to that is, what do you visually see? So if you see, and it depends on the language that you're using and what you're trying to get. Not a biology student, but if you're talking about the heart, you could call it like 2 sections and describe the sections or chambers. I don't know my biology, don't come at me. Right? But if students are visually seeing it, the alt text isn't giving it away, right? So describing what is there, and then it depends on what you're asking them to do. Do they have to name that chamber? It's called the X, Y, and Z, right? You can describe it without naming it if that's the point that they have to name it. If they have to understand the functionality of it, then arguably calling it the X chamber, I am really bad at bio, doesn't give it away. Gemini used more inclusive language than ChatGPT. Sometimes making a longer prompt results in worse results counterintuitively. Very interesting. Okay, Catherine shared the image too. Oh, interesting. Okay. A hand places wooden letter blocks to form the word accessible. Hand turning acceptance. Gemini can't read. Into possible. Okay. But again, so Catherine, I would ask you, why are you using that image? What are you trying to convey with that image? Is that, are you talking about blocks with letters on it? Okay, maybe it's super important. Is that just on a page that you're trying to convey that accessibility is possible? That might be something different. Or maybe it's decorative if it's, you have in text that accessibility is possible and the relationship, and you've explained that in text elsewhere. Maybe it's decorative. Thinking back to cognitive load and how are we supporting all of our students in that way? Context is key, absolutely. And this also goes back to testing it, just like we pilot test designs, make sure that your pilot test includes people with disabilities. Seek out, and pay accordingly if possible, but seek out people to test this with, to get other perspectives, to get that, multiple perspective that Stephanie was talking about earlier. Make sure we're including people. Nothing about us without us. Nothing without us. All of that. All right. Stephanie, feel free to jump in, but this is great. I'm just gonna keep going here. Feel free to jump in for your final section.
Thank you, Amy. What I love is I'm wondering, as folks test this, so how many of you learned about message design in your programs or in your classes? Like, you can do just a quick, raise your hand and put it down. No. Laura, I see your no. Nope. Right, Teresa? First of all, I'm familiar with Teresa's work, and I love Teresa's work. She's been doing work on adapting message design and Mayer's multimedia principles to address learner anxiety and stress. So you really need to check out Teresa's research. Anybody else? Reactions? Okay. Victoria's familiar with Teresa's work. Yeah, okay. So crap or carp is those are really visual design principles, are not really so much message design. But this is interesting. Jill, I hope you're flagging this big time. So I had a feeling, though, that this is where we were headed, because anytime I raise message design, I kind of get blank stares. So in instructional design, for a long time, one of the features of what we focused on was message design. And I think, especially as you guys talk about what your results are, what you're seeing here, how you're thinking your way through that, and even the questions that Amy's raising on what are you trying to convey? What do you want to get across? That is literally what the point of message design was in instructional design. So we actually have, right now, I feel like I'm trying to kind of go back and evoke or drag back into the present, right? Some of these older bodies of knowledge that are actually still very relevant and useful that we've forgotten or tossed aside. And I think this has huge implications for our accessibility practices. So Michelle Estes and I are actually working on a theory paper right now on framing accessibility through the lens of message design, thinking about what are the intended messages and using that to make instructional decisions or learning decisions, right, about what should that alt text be? What should that closed captioning look like? How, and you guys are asking great questions that are exactly exemplary of this, right? Like the question on the biology, or how do you convey information without giving away an answer, because then you're co-opting that learning, right? Or you're short-circuiting the learning process. Those are excellent questions that instructional designers really need to be asking and layering in around accessibility, right? That's literally how we go beyond technical or legal definitions of accessibility to framing this as learning and really thinking about what we're doing from that learning perspective. So we wanted to end with kind of bookend everything, or with this idea of deliberative and reflective practice. So let's go ahead to the next slide, Beth. So reflective practice is, of course, we're drawing heavily from Schoen, who wrote in 1983. He has a book, The Reflective Practitioner, if you're not familiar with it. fantastic book where he talks about different types of reflection that practitioners engage in. In particular, we're most interested, he talked about reflection in action and reflection on action, which is like after the fact, right? The reflection in action is the most interesting loop. And he describes that as this is where the designer is engaging in a conversation with the design, with the product that you're working on in process, right? And you're trying to fold things in as you learn through that conversation with your design to iterate on that and to improve that. So go ahead, Beth. So Monica Tracy and John Bakke, some of you in here may know them. They have a wonderful piece on reflection in action. They define this as when a designer is presented with a complex problem or situation, they show a series of questioning, asking good questions, making a decision based on those questions, reflecting on the consequences of that decision or those decisions, and then based on that reflection, they make another move. So this is how reflective practice isn't just this abstract idea. It is an actual like applied practice that designers do in their work. Okay, Beth. So forms of reflection and practice, there's reflection and inaction. Like I said, this occurs in the middle of the design, development, or process stages. And then there is reflection on action, that occurs after the fact. Okay. Designers frequently use reflection throughout their processes. So I mentioned earlier this study with Ahmed and Victoria, and I pulled this example from a designer where we were asking them about ethics in their work. And this is a team that says, you know, as we engage in our learning design, we paused. Sorry, I don't know what that typo is. We paused when we encountered what we recognized as productive discomfort in our design choices around representation, because our process centers relationality as a value over, say, efficiency or production. We opted to give ourselves space to sit in these ethical tensions with a reflective posture. So this whole act of being a reflective or deliberative designer is really a common and key feature to professional ID practice. So design practices for reflection. A method of design is in which a designer reflects on a problem or need and engages in a reflective process throughout, pausing to consider and contemplate, and then use that reflective process to inform their next steps. So an example, again, I had the one from Litz and her team, Brianna, she's up at either Brigham Young or Utah State, but up in Utah. So they talked about through our process of working through representation, we generated 3 guiding considerations for our prototyping that served to anchor us to the story itself and our shared values. Some strategies that the team used to do this. They used both team and individual reflection strategies. We saw a number of these across various design cases. A lot of designers and design teams use that front-end problem framing that I was talking about. What is the problem you're actually working on? Is it a technical problem or is it a learning problem? Or is it something else? Or is it both of those or all of the above? But taking that time to actually articulate, can you go back, Beth? Taking that time to actually articulate what your problem is. And then devising explicit, intentional, reflective questions. So this isn't just sort of a abstract pondering, right? What designers are doing is they will develop specific questions that they ask themselves repeatedly throughout their project to make sure that they're centering those considerations in their process and in their artifacts. And then identifying moments when it's necessary to pause and reflect. We also saw a lot of designers using journaling. And then Litz and her team talked about they're collaborating with some Native American collaborators. And so they brought in this idea of gathering from the tribe, in the particular tribe that they're working with as well. Okay. So an example of reflection and action, this was a presentation by Ingram and Boyd at AECT back in 2020. I had the pleasure of sitting in on that loved their work. They were working together on designing virtual worlds and simulations for training. Like that was it, that's what they did. So, okay, Beth. They articulated again, a specific central question to reflect on their design process and products. For them, they focused on how do we support social justice for learners. They used problem framing as a tool. So they framed their problem, not merely as learning or technical, right? But they also included racial disparity as part of their problem framing. So here they're working to address both learning needs and other needs or problems. They then selected 3 specific ethical concerns that they wanted to address. So here they're drilling down to be very specific, right, and very tactical. They wanted to tend to whitewashing or normalizing whiteness, racial stereotyping, and digital blackface. So they developed explicit questions that they used to reflect on and question their process throughout, like brainstorming, ideation, prototyping, production, all of that. And here are the 3 questions that they asked as a team together repeatedly. Does this include people of color? Do those characters include racial stereotypes? And who is performing that character? So the point of these examples from like Litz and her team and Ingram and Boyd is that in order to tend to these things, we want to be very intentional, right? And we want to be very explicit. And we can create these reflection and action loops that we integrate into our design process. So, of course, related to accessibility and inclusive design, we can very much do the same thing. So, okay, next slide, Beth. All right, so we want to end with you guys generating ideas. Where's that last slide?
Sorry, I don't know what just happened. I was typing in the chat and then something took over. I don't know.
No problem.
There.
Oh, there
Is
we
this the
go.
right slide?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Thanks, Beth. All right. So first of all, I want you guys to take some time individually, just very quick for a few minutes to jot down your thoughts on each of these. Can you go ahead and animate? Okay, first one, articulate a central question for your work related to accessibility. Just like Ingram and Boyd asked, how do we support social justice for learners? What is a central question you can ask in your work related to accessibility? I'm going to give you just a minute or 2 here to jot something down on that. And then for problem framing, not merely technical, but what is the actual problem that you're trying to solve? Like we asked you to come today with some specific things in mind. And I'd like you to pause to frame that problem that you're working on. What is it that you're trying to work on right now in your work? And how can you frame accessibility into that particular problem? In particular, accessibility as a learning problem, not just a technical or a legal. I'm pausing here to give you a moment to write down some ideas. Sometimes the quiet is nice, isn't it? And then finally, I want you to develop some explicit questions that you can use to reflect on and ask yourself during your process or about your products at all of your different stages or design activities. So I've listed some here. You may be doing more like development or whatnot. But just like how Ingram and Boyd said, we're going to ask ourselves, does this include representation? Who's doing the acting? You know, specific questions that can help you ask, better evaluate, right? Be deliberative about what generative AI is producing for your accessibility, for your alt text or closed captioning or your image or whatever it is. Okay, over in our resources document, we've tried to curate a lot of this together. We've also shared some additional resources that I think we're going to try and get incorporated into that document as well. We want this to be a document that is not just from us, but that we're co-creating, right, with you. Beth has put the link back over there in the chat. Thank you so much, Beth. So it's the same one that we've been going to throughout. In there, let's add some examples of reflective questions that we can ask related to our use of generative AI for accessibility. So for example, some questions that I generated, and we've been talking about some of these throughout. Is this actually more accessible to learners? Is this explaining in too much detail or not enough? Or is it the right detail? Again, you guys were already starting to ask some really great questions as you were beginning to critique the output of ChatGPT 4 or Gemini or, you know, some of the other tools that you were using. Okay. Beth, can you go ahead and, yep. Is it conveying this visual accurately? Is it even accurate? And again, I love the question you were asking about, is it maybe giving away too much of the detail? And then finally, even asking, can all learners participate in the meaning-making process of learning? So this is how we become reflective practitioners, right? Again, not just checking the box of, oh, I need to make this accessible. Let me run out, grab an alt text or whatever. But I think this is where we're hoping to pause and really think about, what does it mean to do this as professionals? So if you could, go ahead and pop over to that document. And if you've generated questions, we put a place in there for reflective questions to ask. So share what you have generated over in that document, please. We want to curate your great ideas and questions and share that out. This resource document is a resource that you can absolutely keep and that we will make sure everybody has access to well beyond this. And at this time, I think I want to go ahead and open it up for questions. I think Jill's probably going to have to scoot because she and I need to pop over for something, and then I'll pop over real quick. But let's go ahead and take any questions or anything that you want to discuss. Yeah, thank you, Elise. Elisa, we also put our slides in the folder that Elisa has shared there with you, which Amy ran through to make accessible, and then I double checked, which really meant just reading what Amy did and saying, yep, looks awesome. So some great examples, even in the slides from Amy, of different ways to think through content. You'll see, like, for example, we marked some of the images as decorative, purely decorative. So.
And Amy added her email into the chat. We're not sure where it went on the slide, but it's there in the chat. Sorry.
Our pleasure. That's absolutely fine. If you guys need to go, we'll hang on a bit in case anybody has questions.
I'm gonna stop the recording though.
Sounds good. Fatima,